Most people think they understand what life was like for a medieval peasant. Hard work, little comfort, early death. The picture is stable enough that it rarely invites revision. The usual assumption is simple. Peasants suffered because they were poor, uneducated, and technologically backward. If you remove those three conditions, the suffering disappears. Modern life, by contrast, feels survivable because it has removed them. That belief is not wrong. It is incomplete. If poverty alone were the explanation, then short bursts of prosperity would have changed outcomes. If ignorance were decisive, then experience would have compensated. If technology were the missing piece, then incremental improvements would have eased the strain. Yet none of these things altered the basic fragility of peasant life in any lasting way. A peasant did not fail because they lacked effort. They failed despite constant effort. This is where the common picture quietly breaks down. The problem was not that peasants worked too little, or planned poorly, or failed to innovate. The problem was that their lives were structured so that survival depended on conditions they could not meaningfully influence. From the outside, peasant life looks physically demanding. From the inside, it was strategically constrained. Every decision when to plant, what to eat, how long to rest, was shaped less by personal judgment and more by overlapping obligations that were invisible to later observers. The unsettling question is not whether peasants had it worse. It is whether survival was ever fully under their control. Consider this carefully. A peasant could do everything right by the standards of their time, work diligently, obey authority, follow custom, and still slide into hunger or debt without any dramatic mistake. Failure often arrived without a single identifiable cause. This makes peasant life difficult to map onto modern intuition. We are used to explanations that rely on individual error, corruption, or cruelty. Medieval life certainly contained all three, but they are not sufficient explanations for why entire populations lived so close to collapse for centuries. What most people imagine as hardship was, in practice, a system calibrated to absorb labor while externalizing risk. The peasant was not merely poor. They were positioned at the end of multiple chains of obligation, each one logical in isolation, collectively unstable. At this point, the usual story would introduce kings, wars, or plagues. That comes later. First, it is necessary to understand what peasants were actually doing with their time, their bodies, and their margins of error, and why those margins were thinner than they appear in retrospect. Because once that structure becomes visible, the outcome stops looking tragic or surprising. It starts to look inevitable. When people imagine a peasant, they usually imagine a poor farmer. This is accurate in the way that calling a cog a piece of metal is accurate. A peasant was not simply someone who worked the land. A peasant was someone whose access to land, food, time, and protection was mediated through layered obligations that were older than written contracts and stronger than personal choice. Farming was only the visible activity. Dependency was the actual condition. To understand this, it helps to discard modern categories like job or income. A peasant did not earn a living so much as occupy a position. That position came with duties rather than wages, expectations rather than rights, and penalties that were predictable even when the rewards were not. The land did not belong to the peasant in any modern sense. It was held in use, not ownership. This meant that effort did not scale the way we expect effort to scale. Working harder could increase yield, but it could not remove obligations tied to that yield. In some cases, it increased them. Think of it less like running a small business and more like operating a machine you do not own, using fuel you must supply yourself, while agreeing in advance to give away a fixed portion of whatever the machine produces, whether it performs well or not. This arrangement made rational sense within its own context. Lords needed predictable output. The church needed regular contributions. The state, where it existed, needed bodies and grain. Risk flowed downward because it had nowhere else to go. What is often missed is that peasants were not passive inside this system. They were experienced, adaptive, and intensely knowledgeable about their environment. They understood soil, weather, animals, and seasons with a precision that modern observers often underestimate. But that knowledge operated within narrow tolerances. A bad harvest did not simply mean eating less. It meant falling behind on rents and dues that did not adjust for weather. It meant borrowing grain at interest rates set by custom, not competition. It meant selling labor earlier, resting less, and eating seed reserves that were supposed to secure the next season. These responses were sensible. They were also cumulative. Over time, each reasonable adjustment reduced future flexibility. The system rewarded survival today at the cost of fragility tomorrow. No single decision caused collapse. Collapse emerged from repetition. This is why peasant life feels static in historical summaries. The visible routines changed little, but the margin for error eroded quietly beneath them. Generation after generation inherited not just land, but constrained options. Seen this way, peasant life was not a failure of imagination or effort. It was a long-term equilibrium stable enough to persist, unstable enough to punish deviation. And once you recognize that equilibrium, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when external pressures increase, but the structure stays the same? That is where the system begins to reveal its limits. Once a system like this exists, it does not need active cruelty to persist. It only needs consistency. The medieval rural economy was built on predictability from above and variability below. Obligations were fixed. Outcomes were not. This asymmetry produced a feedback loop that gradually normalized permanent vulnerability without requiring anyone to articulate it as a goal. From the perspective of landholders and institutions, the logic was straightforward. Rents and tithes were assessed according to customary expectations, not annual conditions. Adjusting them downward after poor harvests would introduce uncertainty into their own planning. Over time, stability for the system's upper layers depended on inflexibility at the bottom. This created an incentive structure where risk was always passed downward, but never eliminated. When harvests were good, surpluses were absorbed. When harvests were bad, deficits remained local. The system did not collapse under stress. It compressed. Peasants adapted rationally. They diversified crops where possible, shared labor, delayed marriages, reduced caloric intake, and relied on informal credit networks. None of this challenged the structure. All of it kept them just functional enough to continue. The important point is that adaptation was not neutral. Every coping strategy carried a cost. Diversification reduced peak yields. Shared labor increased obligation density. Credit introduced future claims on already thin output. What looked like resilience was often the slow conversion of future capacity into present survival. Over time, this produced normalization. Hunger became seasonal rather than exceptional. Debt became routine rather than alarming. Shorter lifespans became expected rather than notable. When stress is constant, it stops registering as a crisis and starts registering as background. At this stage, the system no longer required enforcement through force alone. Custom did most of the work. People planned their lives around constraints they did not believe could change. Children learned early what was possible, and more importantly, what was not. There is a temptation to explain this endurance through ignorance or superstition. That explanation is comforting and incorrect. What sustained the system was not belief, but coordination. No individual peasant could exit the structure without losing access to land, protection, and community. Rational actors stayed inside because leaving was not a viable strategy. Occasionally, authorities did intervene, freezing rents, distributing grain, or suspending obligations. These actions were remembered precisely because they were exceptions. Their rarity reinforced the assumption that hardship was normal, not negotiable. By the time external shocks arrived, population growth, climatic shifts, expanding markets, the system had already used up its slack. There was no buffer left to absorb sustained pressure. The same mechanisms that had preserved stability now amplified strain. This is the critical transition. What had once been a tolerable equilibrium became a brittle one. The system still functioned, but only under conditions that were no longer reliable. At that point, outcomes stopped depending on effort altogether. They began to depend on timing. The system did not announce its failure. It revealed it. For much of the medieval period, peasants lived close to the edge, but rarely fell over it all at once. What changed was not the structure itself, but the frequency with which it was tested. A sequence of pressures, climatic cooling, population density, and expanding extraction arrived close enough together that recovery time disappeared. Shorter growing seasons reduced yields. This alone was survivable. Peasants had endured bad years before. The difference was that bad years stopped arriving in isolation. Reserves meant to cover one failure were consumed covering the next. At the same time, populations had grown during earlier periods of relative stability. More people were working land that did not expand in proportion. Holdings became smaller, output per household thinner, and the margin for error narrower still. None of this required a decision. It emerged naturally from inheritance patterns and demographic momentum. Authorities responded in ways that were locally rational. Rents were reaffirmed to protect revenue. Labor obligations were enforced to maintain production. Controls were placed on movement to prevent sudden workforce loss. Each action addressed an immediate risk. Together, they locked the system into rigidity. The peasant experience changed subtly. Hunger became less seasonal and more persistent. Recovery years no longer restored strength. They merely paused decline. Illness lasted longer. Injuries healed poorly. Children survived less reliably. These were not dramatic events, which is why they were often not recorded as turning points. Then the system encountered a shock large enough to exceed its remaining tolerance. When epidemic disease arrived, it did not introduce fragility. It exposed it. Bodies, already operating at caloric and immunological minimums, failed quickly. Labor shortages followed, not because people suddenly refused to work, but because they could not. Here, the system faced a contradiction. Scarcity of labor should have improved peasant leverage. In theory, fewer workers increase bargaining power. In practice, obligations were not designed to renegotiate. Attempts to freeze wages and restrict movement were not acts of malice. They were attempts to preserve a framework that no longer matched reality. From the peasant's position, the world became briefly unstable. Old rules weakened before new ones formed. Some individuals improved their situation, many did not. The important point is that survival still depended less on choice than on location, timing, and institutional response. This is where the image of medieval life often stops: plague, unrest, adjustment. But stopping here misses the deeper pattern. The system did not collapse because it was cruel or outdated. It collapsed because it had optimized for continuity under narrow conditions, and those conditions ended. Once that happened, the outcome was no longer a question of endurance. It was a question of how long the structure could pretend nothing fundamental had changed. By the end, nothing dramatic needed to happen. Peasant life did not vanish overnight. It thinned, fractured, and reorganized. In some regions, obligations softened. In others, they hardened. In many places, the label remained while the conditions beneath it shifted just enough to keep the system recognizable. What matters is not the variation, but the pattern. For centuries, peasants lived inside a structure that converted effort into survival with minimal surplus and maximal exposure. It functioned because environmental and demographic conditions stayed within a narrow range. When those conditions drifted, the structure did not adapt quickly enough to protect the people inside it. This is why the idea that you wouldn't survive a week as a peasant is misleading in a specific way. Individuals did survive, millions of them, across generations. What would not survive was a modern expectation of control. A contemporary person placed into peasant life would not fail because they were weak or unskilled. They would fail because the system would not allow experimentation, recovery, or error. The habits that make modern survival possible, adjusting plans, changing strategies, seeking alternatives, were structurally constrained. From the inside, this did not feel like oppression in a dramatic sense. It felt like necessity. Most decisions were made not to improve life, but to prevent it from becoming immediately worse. That orientation shaped behavior more powerfully than fear or obedience ever could. Once you recognize this, the long endurance of peasant societies becomes easier to understand. They were not waiting to be liberated. They were balancing on a narrow ledge, generation after generation, because stepping off in any direction carried immediate risk. The eventual transformations markets, wage labor, migration, enclosure are often described as progress or disruption, depending on perspective. What they actually represent is a reallocation of risk. Some people gained flexibility, others lost security. The system changed because it had to, not because it was persuaded. Seen in hindsight, the outcome feels unavoidable. A structure designed to function without slack cannot absorb prolonged stress. It will persist, rigid and efficient, until it suddenly cannot. That is the uncomfortable continuity across history. Systems rarely fail because no one worked hard enough or believed strongly enough. They fail because they succeed too well at preserving themselves under assumptions that quietly expire. The medieval peasant did not misunderstand their world. They understood it precisely. What they lacked was not knowledge, but room. And without room, survival becomes a matter of timing rather than choice. That is why you would not survive a week, not because life was harsher, but because it allowed less forgiveness.